Hello again, everyone. Welcome to my Patreon site. It's the vodcast where the events of today seem to me to collide with the events of the past.
Hi, Neil. I gather something has sent you racing back nearly 2,500 years to ancient Greece this week.
It was triggered by events here in Scotland. There was an attempt, briefly, by the Home Office to pick up two illegal immigrants, as they were being described, and to take them off to some, part of the process of deportation or whatever. It was in Glasgow. The local community there got wind of it, gathered en masse around the vehicle, and to cut a long story short, the men were released, and the whole attempt was abandoned, if only temporarily. I don't know anything about the case of the two men. I don't know who they were or what their background was, but it was the fact that it was a large group of people, hundreds and hundreds of people had just descended, and by their actions they prevented the government going about their business. And in some quarters, of course, it was being reported as a mob. Now, somebody else's words, not mine, but the fact that it was being described as a mob just triggered something in my head about, because I'm not for one moment suggesting that the people that gathered there were a mob. It looked pretty peaceful to me. It just looked like a large number of people all crammed together, but it all looked, pretty good natured, really. But some people were using the word mob, and so I thought about mob rule. And it's about looking on it in America, say, looking on at what's happening in cities like Seattle, where there's been popular takeover, let's say, of areas and districts. Here in the UK, of course, we've had similar people gathering to protest, and sometimes the police stand by, and sometimes the police get involved and try to disperse it. But you can see it's a reflection, obviously, of the people, or sections of the people coming together in groups in hopes of changing the direction of decisions and behaviours by those that claim and aim to rule them. And there's something about watching it happen again and again and again in one place after another that for me, I find helplessly, you start to think about, is there big change coming? And you see it as you can't help but see it as a recurrent theme of the human story. We seem to have something in our human wiring where we all think quite often that the end of the world is nigh. That millenarianism and the idea that we happen to be living through the time when the world will come to an end, or civilization will collapse, or there'll be some sort of great revolution, the Great Reset. And we've certainly got it among us now. And Hannah Arendt was a German political writer, theorist, and during the time of some of the trials of Nazi war criminals, she came up with a line about that people cyclically seem to get tired of the status quo, and they seem to get to a point where anything sounds better than what they've got now. People just have seen a state of affairs, a status quo for such a long time that they think, well, any kind of change would be better. And her argument was that totalitarianism breeds and feeds on that thinking. And she said that once you've got that idea of people holding what they have in contempt, the second step is the notion things must change no matter how. Anything is better than what we have. And so totalitarian rulers, or would-be totalitarian rulers, can organize that kind of mass sentiment. They can take advantage of it, and they can organize it and articulate it, and then if they can spin it effectively, the people themselves come to love it. They come to love the idea of totalitarian rule. If you follow that line of thinking, you do inevitably arrive at the ancient Greece that you mentioned in your introduction, Paul. There was Plato, of whom everyone has heard, great philosopher of ancient Greece. He said something to put it simply. He said that civilizations start good, then they get bad, then they get worse, then they fall apart, and then they get good again. So it's like stages, good, bad, worse, fall apart, get back to good again. And so various of the ancient Greeks had come up with this. But after Plato's time, there was a Greek writer called Polybius, who was born around 200 years BC, there or thereabouts, in the city of Megalopolis, and in ancient Greece. And he synthesized that thinking, and he wrote about a theory that it wasn't his own theory, but he perhaps wrote about it most effectively. It's called anacyclosis. And in anacyclosis, it's the idea that civilization is in a cycle of birth, decay, and rebirth. Now, I'm going to horribly butcher his elegant thinking, but he suggests that you start out with a benevolent king in a territory. A benevolent king rises, and everybody loves him, and his rule is good and fair. So everyone's happy. But then, of course, his life comes to an end, and he's succeeded by a son, let's say, who becomes the next king. And either he is not as good as his father was, or perhaps his son, the benevolent king's grandson, or at some point a descendant is not as good, is not benevolent. And so he becomes, he starts to have a corrupt side to his nature. And so the other powerful people around him, the aristocrats, rise up eventually and depose that less than benevolent king, so that now you go from the rule of the monarchy to the rule of the aristocracy. You've got aristocrats ruling. At first, they're okay. They're quite nice. They rule quite benevolently, quite well. But the process begins again, and the next generation of those aristocrats is more venal, more self-interested, and more corrupt, and until that decays into a rule of oligarchy, which is like kind of tyrants, the rule of self-interested wealthy people. And then eventually the people who are being ruled, the proletariat or the polis, they get pushed too far, and they rise up and they overthrow the oligarchs. So then you have the rule of the demos. You have democracy. You have the rule of the people, which is kind of what we tell ourselves that we have at the moment. Democracy is good for a while. Democracy rules benevolently. Again, there's a period of happiness, but that becomes corrupt as well. And the people themselves start to be so dissatisfied with the rule of the democracy that they change it. And then you get the rule of the mob, mobile vulgaris, those among us who don't have the interests of the many at heart. But you get this rule by the mob. Then the mob is a disaster. Rule by the mob cannot work. And the people begin to cry out for a leader, a hero, someone to get them out of the mess. And so in Polybius's idea of anacyclosis, what rises then is the demagogue, a charismatic figure who seems to be strong, who seems to be powerful, who seems to cut through all the nonsense and to point a way back to true north, back to a better beginning. So that's the rule of the demagogue. Then ultimately the demagogue is overthrown, and what follows the demagogue is a benign king. And now you're back to the start again. But that cycle will repeat and repeat and repeat. And I find that deeply fascinating at the moment, because that's what it feels like. It feels like we're being told that we're living through the end of times. It feels like we're being told that democracy, which we were all sort of raised to admire, has run its course, and that something must replace it. And of course, you don't have to look far around the world in very recent past to see the rise and success of people that you might describe as demagogues, charismatic strongmen who seem to promise a simple way back to the truth. And that, in the model of anacyclosis, is us getting to the end of one cycle and the start of another. And I just, I feel as if I'm aware that I might be being swept along in a current. It's like a river that's coming into flood, and that even I am starting to lose my footing in it and starting to feel, are we possibly at the end of one period of rule and the beginning of something quite different.
It's incredible that thinking from ancient Greece still has a resonance in the modern world.
Well, it's not even new when you find it in ancient Greece. That's the point. When I said earlier, I think it's in our wiring. It's almost like a glitch in the matrix or something. It's almost as if it's in our programming. You know how they say that there's a kind of a center in the brain that's sensitive to the idea of God. You know, there's a sort of a kind of a portion or an area, a zone in the brain that responds to the suggestion of a transcendent deity, and you can trigger it not just by religion, but with some people's experience of hallucinogenic drugs makes them feel as if they've stepped into the presence of a deity. So that so the suggestion is that there's something in the brain that's just ready to be triggered by that idea. And I wonder if likewise there might be just part of our makeup as maybe it's part of the survival instinct. We're from hunter stock, we're predators. So as well as hunting, we know what it is to be hunted. We're aware of threat and danger. And I wonder if part of our self-preservation, not just for ourselves, but maybe for family and children, we're always on the lookout for the next disaster. But it's so old. If you go into the Hindu tradition, Hinduism, the religion of India, is so old. It has roots going back, so far, so deep that it's beyond the point where anybody could really pinpoint where Hinduism started. It's certainly, 10,000 years old, older than that. And part of the Hindu tradition is the idea of a cycle of enormously long periods of time. In the Hindu tradition, there's an idea of the god head, which is neither male nor female, but that somehow permeates and is everything. And according to the Hindu tradition, being an omniscient god, knowing everything, being able to predict everything that's going to happen, is incredibly boring. And so every now and again, the godhead puts himself to sleep, or puts itself to sleep, so that it can go into a period. That's my dog. So that it can go into a period where it doesn't know what's happening, and it experiences life by us. So you're you're a manifestation of the Godhead. I'm a manifestation of the Godhead. It's all the Godhead. But and the dream lasts for it's like millions of years. Can you hear my wolfhound pup drinking?
I can.
That's how much she cares about what's going on. It's periods of millions of years, and it's divided into four, and so the Godhead is asleep for I think it's something like 1.8 million years. I'm gonna have to let her out.
Do you notice her getting bigger?
Oh, she's huge, but she's not as huge as she's going to be. So you've got 1.8 million years. It's divided into four. And with each, the Godhead has a good time for the first quarter, a not so good time for the second quarter, a really beginning to deteriorate time for the third quarter. And then you enter what the Hindu tradition calls the Kali Yuga. And a yuga is an age of the earth. And according to the Hindu tradition, it started about 3,000 years BC. So we're well into it by now, but it's got another 400,000 years to run. But this period of time, according to the Hindu tradition, Kali Yuga, is bad. It's the period when everything starts to fall apart. And so according to that Hindu tradition, from here on in, everything just gets worse until eventually, at the end of that, to us, an unimaginably long period of time, it's the end of the world. It's the end of everything. And at that point, the Godhead wakes up and thinks, wow, what a trip. What an adventure that was. And is then awake for many, many more millions of years. And then the whole cycle starts again. And Carl Sagan, the American cosmologist. Now, Carl Sagan was one of the first, I suppose, modern scientists to acknowledge the fact that the Hindu tradition was the first of all the cultures and civilizations on planet Earth to speculate about a timescale so vast Everybody else, before and after Hinduism, imagined that the world was maybe a few thousand years old. The universe was a few thousand years old. But Carl Sagan pointed out that the Hindu tradition, that oldest of old traditions, had somehow understood instinctively that the universe must be much, much, much older. And he pointed out that the time scales that the Hindu faith suggests for the universe and for time are unnervingly close to the timescales that have been revealed by concepts like the Big Bang. All of that fanciful thinking and talking is just another way of reminding ourselves that idea of the universe being in a cycle, good, bad, worse, end, start again, has been with us from the very beginning. And here we are in the 21st century. Here we are doing it again. People have predicted the end of the world is nigh over and over and over again, and it's out there among us now. And there's something very fascinating, profoundly fascinating, I would say, when you think about anacyclosis and Polybius and the idea of the kingdom, the aristocracy, the oligarchy, the democracy, the mob rule, the demagogue, the rise of the demagogue, and then the hands on the big clock come back to midnight, ding, 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 and the whole cycle starts again.
Do you seek solace and calm in the lessons history teaches us?
Yes. We are definitely living through interesting times. There's a lot going on, and there's a sensation of something that was moving quite quickly anyway, accelerating. All the period of upheaval, exciting as it's been so far, seems to be speeding up. And you get this feeling that something's got to give, and that can be an unnerving thought. But then I counter that feeling by remembering that we've always done this. That it's that belief that you go from good to bad to worse to disaster, and then everything starts again. That's deeply reassuring. It's a recurrent theme. And whichever version of it you buy into, whether it's the anacyclosis of Polybius, or whether it's the Christian message, or whether it's the epic timescales of the Hindu tradition, that feeling that, well, things might get bad. They might get to the point where they break, but then after they're broken, there will be a rebuilding and a return quite quickly to some kind of good, maybe even some kind of perfect. So there's the two things side by side. There's the anxiety that we might be looking at some sort of end of times or some period of change, but then hopefully it goes in the good direction. So you can be pessimistic and optimistic both at the same time. In the way that Carl Sagan thinks, his brain was so big, he was so open to the potential of understanding that he was making room both for the very best of mathematics and physics and cosmology of his civilization, but he was making room in that same big brain for the ancient tradition of Hinduism, which had arrived at some of the same idea from a completely different direction, maybe 10,000 years ago. I mean, in the Tao Te Ching, the book, the ancient Chinese book by Lao Tzu, thousands of 2,500 years old, he says, there is a thing inherent and natural that existed before heaven and earth, motionless and fathomless. It stands alone and never changes. It pervades everywhere and yet never becomes exhausted. It may be regarded as the mother of the universe. I don't know its name, but I call it Tao, and I name it as supreme. Now, that sounds like dark matter. A thing inherent and natural that existed before heaven and earth, motionless and fathomless, pervades everywhere yet never becomes exhausted. And then 2,000 years later, scientists come up with the idea that 95% of the visible universe is something they can't see. So they're arriving at these same destinations again and again from different directions. And so that idea of the cyclical nature of time and the cyclical nature of a universe that is born and burns out and then comes back again, there must be something in it, because it's an idea and a notion that has been there in myth, and then in the most modern, up-to-date science that we have, they find a different way to express the same concept. There's got to be something reassuring in that.